So I would like to thank Dr. Hoffman for joining me today as my guest on the podcast. Dr. Hoffman is a board certified plastic surgeon of the Laser and Skin Surgery Center of New York. I will be featuring your website as well. It's www.laserskinsurgery.com. And just a brief intro about Dr. Hoffman. For the people who did not know him, because he is, if you're even remotely connected in plastic surgery, one of the stalwarts and biggest names that we have. Dr. Hoffman trained in general surgery with Dr. Tom Shires at Cornell Medical Center, and he followed. And also correct me if any of this stuff that I pull from the internet is not correct, or my recollection is not correct. You trained with Dr. Tom Shires at Cornell Medical Center in general surgery, followed by training in plastic surgery, hand and microsurgery at NYU. And this was always the refrain I have always heard, I guess to inspire young plastic surgeons or make us feel inadequate. At the age of 30, or was it 31, in 1987, you became the youngest chief of a plastic surgery program in history when you became chairman of plastic surgery at Cornell Medical Center in New York City, and was there at 17 years or so as a chair, training many of the plastic surgeons around the country and the world. In 2004, you left and ran an extremely successful private practice in the mecca of cosmetic plastic surgery, which is on the Upper East Side, and did that for 13 years or so. And then you recently, in 2017, returned into an academic practice as an associate professor of surgery at Columbia University Medical Center. You're listed as having managed over 15,000 patients over your career. Plus. You do everything from face, breast, body, as well as non-invasive facial rejuvenation. And from a personal standpoint, I've only known you more in passing because I was uptown at Columbia for most of my training. And then by the time I worked at Cornell as a young faculty member, you had already gone into private practice. But I wanted to interview you and talk to you because you were always very kind, very positive, and encouraging. And I saw you speak last year when you came out to New Jersey at Hackensack, and you still have this huge sense of enthusiasm. You're continuously learning, and you're fully engaged in your practice and teaching. And I talked to a couple people for this interview. I talked to Rick Winters, I talked to Mia Talmore, as well as others, and they had nothing but the highest of praise for you in all respects. So in that regard, thank you again, Dr. Hoffman, for joining me.
Well, Sam, you're much too kind, but that doesn't surprise me. I mean, I've known you for years, and you're really one of the good guys in plastic surgery. And you asked me to do this; it was a no-brainer. I'd be more than happy to do anything for you, and I thank you for your time.
I really appreciate it. The only bad thing I could get out of any of them was that Rick said you were an awful dresser, and he said that that was coming from him, who's an awful dresser himself. So I guess he said it took one to know one.
I guess it's pretty good company, and my wife would probably agree with that.
So the first thing I wanted to do is talk to you a little bit about growing up, because you you graduated Franklin and Marshall as an undergrad in 1974. And back then, what was, during your early years growing up as a youth and then in college, what were the factors that made you lean towards medicine and then ultimately surgery?
Hey, I'm not really sure what stimulated my interest in medicine. I always enjoyed tinkering around with my dad's tools. He was a general contractor, and he had a workshop in the house. He was always fixing things. So that was a big part of my life growing up. When I decided that I'd like to go to medical school, it was the time of the Vietnam War, and I was thinking about undergraduate programs. And I knew I wanted to be a physician. I wasn't doing it to avoid the draft or anything. So I chose Franklin and Marshall because it was a small liberal arts college that had a very powerful biology and pre-med program. And you could not apply to medical school unless you were recommended by this committee. So that's why I chose Franklin and Marshall. It was an excellent experience. And then I went from there to Northwestern in Chicago. I love being in Chicago. I have family there. It was just a a wonderful experience. The weather wasn't so great. We used to say there were two seasons, winter and July 4th. But I spent a lot of time in thinking about cardiology. I was fascinated by the circulatory system until I did a rotation in general surgery my third year. And that was the clincher. I worked with a man who was finishing his 5 years of general surgery before going into urology, and that was very unusual those days and even today. And Kozlowski was quite a character, but he always encouraged me when I was in the operating room with him late at night and we were doing a hot appendix. He'd put a hot appendix in my hand and he'd say, "Hoffman, just think you could be on the ward following dig levels." So that's kind of what pushed me into surgery. From then, I decided I'd like to return to New York, and I applied to Cornell. I was fortunate enough to match there. I'm not sure it was an actual match in those days. I can't remember exactly how it happened. My chief, John Beal, at Northwestern, called his friend, Dr. Tom Shires, and the rest is history. So I spent 5 years there. I was convinced I was going to go into trauma. I liked the action that I saw at Jamaica Hospital, trauma center, knife and gun club. That was wonderful. But then I did a rotation at Memorial, and there were some huge holes that the plastic surgeons had to fill. As you know, in those days, it was a very aggressive surgical center, and the plastic surgeons had plenty of work. And for me, plastic surgery was creative. You had to think about what you were doing, and you can make a significant difference, and there was immediate gratification. So that led me into the world of plastic surgery. From there, I went down to NYU and spent 4 years down there, and that was a great experience operating and learning at Bellevue. I had some wonderful colleagues that I'm friendly with to this day. And you mentioned the return to New York Hospital. That was unusual because I was going to go up to Boston. I had actually signed on the dotted line to join Bob Goldwyn in practice with Sumner Slavin.
That's at Mass General, right?
Yeah, at Beth Israel. They were
Beth Israel.
It was the Mass General program. It was very exciting to me. My wife and I went up there. They wined and dined us, and she said, "Well, we're not coming here." I said, "Okay, great." Her parents were ill at the time, and we came back to New York. So I looked around, I looked at private practice, and then decided to return to New York Cornell to the full-time faculty. On June 30th, 1987, I made a call to the division office, and I said, I'd like to meet with the incoming residents. I'm going to be starting there tomorrow. I'd like to meet with them this evening. And the office said, "Well, we have got a little bit of a problem. We never got around to choosing the residents that were starting there." I said, "Well, I'd like to talk to the chief." They said, "Well, we haven't heard from the chief in a long time. We have some paperwork that hasn't been filled out for the accreditation committee, so we may not be fully accredited." So I said to myself, "Oh man, what did I do now?" So I started there July 1, and Dr. Shires called me into his office and said, "Hoffman, don't worry, it's all yours." And I just finished my fellowship the day before. So the first thing I did was to call Dr. McCarthy, who was always a gentleman and very supportive. He said, "Lloyd, don't worry, we'll work through it together." So that's how that started. We would go down. I would take the second-year residents who had 1 foot out the door down there with me to conferences. At that time, there was a vacancy hotline for residents who did not match. And I was very blessed to choose 3 fantastic residents who were with me for the 2 years at that time. And we started to develop a program. And the rest is history, as I say.
When you see, and you must see a fair number of young people still interested in, talking to you, looking to you for advice for either going into medicine or further on down the road into surgery. What kind of advice do you give them when they ask you, what do I need to do, or what do you think?
Having been on both sides of the fence, both academic and private practice, I urge the plastic surgery residents, at least, to think about an academic setting to start off with. I think it's very difficult to go from private practice to academic. I did it, but that was an unusual situation. I think most people go from academics to private practice. And I think when you're beginning your professional life, I think it's important to be in an atmosphere where you can develop your skills, develop your approach to patients, develop professional relationships. So I would urge plastic surgeons to do that, or at least think about that. And we can get into this later, but I may be changing my tune just a little bit when it comes to that. We'll get back to that in just a minute.
Mhm.
Um, in terms of medical students, I see an awful lot of eager medical students who are thinking about surgery, thinking about plastic surgery. I try to make them see the beauty of plastic surgery. I tell them that I'm biased, that whatever rotation they're going to go to, people are going to try to convince them to do that specific area of surgery or medicine, whatever it may be. And that's what you want. You want to look at these things, experience them for yourself, and then figure out what you want to do.
Um,
Plastic surgery, obviously, as you know, is that we get to operate on every part of the body and make significant differences in people's lives. And there are a number of reasons to go into plastic surgery, I think, from my perspective.
Now, back then, you trained with Dr. Shires, and I only know him from his book. It was when I was in medical school, you always had to choose. Do you get the Schwartz Shires book or do you get the Sabiston book? I got Dr. Shires' book, which I thought was very good. He, I did not know a lot about him until I started doing some research on you, and I did not realize that he had operated on both John Connolly and Lee Harvey Oswald at Parkland before he came to Cornell. And when I talked to people, he did not. It's funny. I guess he was one of those really old school surgeons. He didn't think much of plastic surgery back then. Is that true? And he basically relied on you because he trusted you. He knew you. You trained with him, and he said, if I'm going to have someone who's heading up my plastic surgery program, which was a sudden. The previous chairman was a sudden loss. Who suddenly, there was a abrupt opening. Was that the situation? Like, what was it like working with Dr. Shires back then and then
Well,
stepping
he
into that?
wasn't, as you said, Sam. He wasn't a huge fan of plastic surgery. He thought that plastic surgeons charged $1,000 an hour, and that to him was outrageous. Their procedures were a few hours, and they charged $1,000. He couldn't even imagine that. What you mentioned about his time at Parkland, he brought up a group of surgeons, Malcolm Perry, Horowitz, Carreri. These were giants in surgery, and most of them Southerners. And he brought them up to New York Hospital. And a couple of them, not all of them, but a couple of them would talk about the fateful assassination of John Kennedy. Um, and one of them had done a trach on him, and it was really interesting to talk about their lives in surgery. But Dr. Shires was not warm and fuzzy, I can tell you that much. I mean, he was more the ilk of Spencer down at NYU.
Mm-hmm.
And, you know, I vividly remember M&M, where once a week, the third year, would have to get up and present a complication. And this was a nightmare. I mean, he'd start screaming. He said, "Boy, what did that man do to your mother?" It was just horrible. And I remember a friend of mine presenting, and he wasn't even there for the surgery. Dr. Shire said, "You weren't there?" He said, "No." "Where were you?" He said, "Dr. Shires, I was in church." It was a different kind of life. I mean, we learned how to operate, we learned how to take care of patients, but it was just some. I remember we were making rounds one day, and he was going to make professor rounds, and the chief resident on our service, I was the second year. Chief resident said, "Hoffman, Shires is coming," and we had this disaster on the floor that everything went wrong. So he didn't want to present that patient to Shires. They said, "Hoffman, do me a favor, go put an eye patch on Mr. So-and-so." So I said, "Why? Just do it." So I put an eye patch on this poor guy, and Dr. Shires came by and said, "What's the story with that man in the corner bed?" And the chief said, "I don't know, Dr. Shires, he's on the ophthalmology service." So, well, it was it was wonderful. It was a wonderful back on it. It was different. But anyway, you're right. He did not have much respect for plastic surgery.
Mhm.
Trusted me for whatever reason, and that's how it went down.
Now, because I think of your personality, and these are what people have said about you, is that um, these are descriptions that people have given about you, that your ego does not require satisfaction, which is very unusual for both surgeons and plastic surgeons. You're more inclusionary as opposed to a zero-sum game, especially for a plastic surgeon on the Upper East Side. You are very bright, gentle, and humble. So where did you develop this personality through this entire crucible that is general surgery and so forth?
I don't know who you're talking about, but um, when I think about building a program, and this is where humility comes into it, I think. You have to be willing to take on attendings, associates who are brighter and more talented than yourself. I think that's really important to developing a program. When the program director's ego gets in the way, I think the program suffers. So I think that's a concrete example of, the right thing to do. In terms of the residents and their view of me, I try to direct them, I try to help them, I try to teach them. But I think that one of the most important things that I will instill in the residents, I remember early on, I would say to the residents, "I do not want you to leave the hospital in the evening unless you've done all three of these things. Number one, you need to have taught somebody something. I don't care whether it's a patient, a nurse, a medical student. You need to have learned something yourself, whether it's from a patient, whether it's from another surgeon, whether it's from a book, right? And you need to have helped somebody. If you can't say that you did those three things during a day in your residency, that day doesn't count. And I don't want you to leave the hospital until you do those things." I think that's what I try to instill in the residents. I try to be humble. I try. Sometimes it doesn't work, but I try.
Now, when you were chair at the time, it was, I don't want to say a golden era of plastic surgery, maybe we could call it that, but there was a lot of growth in the field. Microsurgery was really starting to come on, and there was a lot of developments. Cosmetic surgery. You're in a program that had a ton of resources. You trained residents at Memorial Sloan Kettering. You had New York Hospital, which is a flagship in New York. They mentioned that they would go out to Jamaica and Queens as well for additional training. Hospital for Special Surgery, North Shore, the only burn center in the surgery in the center. Only burn center in the city was at Cornell. So that was really a blessing in many ways for the residents who trained with you, wasn't it?
It was. We were fortunate to be in a center that had all of those resources. But I was always doing a dance. I was always trying to do what was best for the residents. Sometimes they spend time at one hospital where they were just watching. One of the residents said they were in a hospital and he felt like he was doing an ophthalmology elective because he was just watching so much. So, I tried to convince these institutions that it's important for our residents to get the experience that they needed. And the RRC was breathing down our necks. I mean, we had to really provide strong experience for the residents because of our history. They didn't trust us. They didn't trust somebody so young. So, my feet were being held to the fire. And there was a time when we didn't see enough facial fractures in New York. The laws had changed in terms of speed limits and seat belts, and we just weren't seeing facial fractures anymore. So I had to send the residents down to spend time with Paul Manson at Shock Trauma. And that was a wonderful experience for them. And they were able to get what they needed. But it was a constant struggle. When you're dealing with an orthopedic hospital and a hand service, you really need to be sure that our residents are doing what they need to do. So, yeah, there were a lot of resources, but a lot of juggling as well.
You had faculty members at the time, Greg LaTrenta, Dr. Gale, Mia Talmore. At Sloan Kettering, you had David Hidalgo, who was out there, and Peter Cordero. All these faculty members. What was it like as a young chair, like you said, trying to put all of this together, hiring people, growing a program? Was that, like you said, scary? Was it great? Was it something you relished?
No, Sam, I always enjoy a challenge, and this was indeed a challenge. I could not have done it without, again, these talented faculty members and without the help of the people down in NYU. And to be honest, a few of them were not so helpful. They would say, I'm sure you'd like to step back and just be the program director, and I could take over as chief, and we'd have a great program. These were giants. I mean, speak about giants. These people down in NYU were amazing, and I feel very blessed to have been taught by them and with them. So yeah, I mean, it was a challenge, but it was fun. It really was.
From a politics standpoint, like you said, dealing with all of these stalwarts, all of the things that are going on in New York, I think one of the things most of the people who knew you said was that you were good at, say, financial development. You were good at the politics, but you didn't necessarily relish it in any way, shape, or form. How do you deal? Like, to me, that would be the worst part of being a chair, is dealing with that sort of thing.
Yeah, the financial stuff is very, very difficult. The amount of support you get from the Department of Surgery, the amount of support you get from the hospital, your relationships with the hospital. It's always very tricky. I remember a young faculty member was bitching and moaning about his salary, and we were under the thumb of general surgery, and Dr. Shires at the time had this office on the 7th floor. We were on the 6th floor, and he had an electric door that once you sat down in his chair, he'd press a button under his desk, and the door would close. We'd have some privacy. So this faculty member said, "Look, you got to go talk to Shires. I can't take this anymore. I'm married, whatever." I said, "Okay, I'll go talk to him." So I made an appointment to go talk to him. I went to see him. I walked in the door. I said, "Dr. Shires, how are you?" He says, Hoffman, come sit down. I said, okay. So I sit down in the chair, and then I hear that sound that I sometimes, when I'm having a bad night, I hear that door. It was like a slam. Dr. Shias was a great conversationalist. So we would be talking about this and that, and about Kennedy, and about Malcolm Perry, and about vascular surgery, and this and that. Horowitz was complaining he wasn't busy enough. He was teaching the residents, and he had to leave. The resident says, "Where are you going?" He had office hours, but he would never say he had office hours. He said he had office minutes. He was complaining. So, and then he said, "Okay, thanks for coming down." So I walked to the sixth floor, and this guy says to me, "Well, what did he say?" I said, "Well, I really don't know. But we didn't talk about your salary. What are you reading about?" I said, "I really don't know." So, eventually we made some changes, and it worked out. But it's tough. It's tough. I had a good relationship with the CEO of the hospital, David Skinner. He had come from Chicago, was a tremendous general surgeon, did a lot of esophageal stuff. And he was very kind to me. He really was. You may have heard the story, and we can get into it or not, but unfortunately, Columbia had some issues, and residents were doing some things that they weren't supposed to be doing. The RRC shut down the program. I mean, I'm not telling you anything you don't know and anything that's not out there. And the hospitals had merged. Columbia Presbyterian and New York Hospital had merged to form New York Presbyterian Hospital. And Skinner came to me again because everybody at Columbia was gone, the faculty, the residents, everybody was gone. And he said, "I need you to take over and develop a program." So we actually merged the divisions, and the divisions have merged to this day. Sometimes they're close, sometimes they're not so close, but in theory, it's a combined division. And that has, I think, even strengthened the program even more. And that was all because of Skinner. He had the faith in me to do that, and it wasn't easy. I mean, there were personalities up at Columbia, as you know,
Mhm.
strong, who didn't know me from Adam. So it was difficult. It really was difficult. So that was the second series of problems that I faced. First was coming from Cornell, and then the
Mhm.
second was merging the divisions.
There's a lot there that, yeah, I had personal experience with. I was right in the middle of it, but I will say the most positive thing out of it was the fact that you were able to merge them. I think that was the best thing that could have happened, and I think both programs are better off for it. I agree with you absolutely on that. I want to ask you about Dr. Harry Arliss, because when he was spoken of, when I got to Cornell, it was always very quiet, and I didn't know a lot about him. But what I wanted to ask you is, what did you want people to remember about him? Because there's really not a lot that people say, and I would want to say, he's someone who passed in 2004. He was a surgeon at Cornell, and I think because so little has been said about him, I would really want you to tell me, what is it that you think is important that we know about Dr. Arliss?
Well, I wasn't anticipating that question.
Sorry. You don't
Uh,
have to answer if you
it's
don't want.
okay. It's okay. It was really a low point for me in my professional career. Harry was an extraordinary person, an incredible surgeon. I knew Harry when he was an ENT resident at Cornell, and he would always hang out with us, come to our conferences, and spend time with us in the operating room. And he decided that he did want to go into plastic surgery. So after training in ENT, he he allowed us to train him in plastic surgery. And at the time, it was interesting because I would always urge ENT residents who were thinking about plastic surgery, even facial plastic surgery, to do 3 years or 2 years at that time of plastic surgery, as opposed to doing 1 year of some cosmetic fellowship. Because in those days, it's not that way now, but in those days, people would always question your credentials. Now those fellowships are much improved and they do a lot of cosmetic stuff within ENT, so it's different now. But in those days, I would say, why would you want to do that when you could do 2 years and no one would question your credentials and you could operate on every part of the body? So Harry took that advice, he joined us, and we trained him. And it was interesting. Harry, he loved to operate on the nose. And I tell you, nobody knew their way around the nose the way Harry did. He was just great. And he taught me so many things about operating on the nose. He was a great teacher. He had a tremendous number of interests. He could talk to you about anything. We had a huge saltwater fish tank in the office, and he maintained it. He knew everything about saltwater fish and tropical fish. Most people don't know this about Harry, but he went to Yale undergraduate. He was a great baseball player. He was a pitcher. And he was number 2 on the pitching rotation at Yale.
Wow.
Number 1 was Ron Darling.
No way.
Yeah. So you can imagine how good he was. And then, unfortunately, he had some personal issues, went through a divorce, started drinking, and that was the beginning of the end. I tried everything I could to get help for him, and would often go to his apartment and comfort him and talk to him, but it was just a horrible thing, just a horrible thing.
Hmm.
And Harry was never really he wasn't replaceable. Nobody could really replace him. We've had some great people, but he was very special. He was a friend, and he was a teacher for me, and a wonderful surgeon. And he was sorely missed. I'll tell you a story, maybe a little bit humorous. I'm not so familiar with wakes. So I went to his wake, and I got there for the viewing, and I must have gotten there early. So it was just the 2 of us. It was Harry and me. And he was sitting up. And I'm not used to that. I started talking to him. I started crying. I told him how much I missed him. And I'll never forget that.
Thank you. One of the things I learned about you, which I did not realize, is that you're one of the very few plastic surgeons to have collaborated with a Nobel Prize winning researcher. And I did not know this, but you worked with Dr. Ralph Steinman. Is that true?
Yes, although, I mean, it may have been my idea to work with him, and he was very accommodating, just a true gentleman, a brilliant man. He was at Rockefeller University, and I'd often go just chat with him about his views on life, and it was wonderful. In terms of the science, I must give credit to Dr. Mia Talmore, who really did the basic science research with him with regard to dendritic cells and transplantation. He was the father of dendritic cells, and we were convinced that they played some role in rejection. And, I wish I would have carried it further. maybe supported Mia more. She just put so much time and effort into it, and we did produce a number of papers. I started thinking about it when I was in plastic surgery, and there were two things that inspired me to think about transplant. One was Dr. McCarthy would always say, this microsurgery is great, and that was at its infancy. Microsurgery is great, but what's really going to save plastic surgery is transplantation. And he used to talk to us about his friend Joe Murray, who actually won the Nobel Prize. He was a plastic surgeon, won the Nobel Prize for his work in kidney transplantation. And Joe would always talk about that. So that was always in the back of my mind. And there was a paper from Mass General which referred to selective transplantation and how you would somehow affect the immunogenicity of the part before you put it on. And that was fascinating to me. So I spoke to Ralph about it. I spoke to Mia about it, who was a medical student, a resident, and attending with us. And she took the ball and she ran with it. So that was it. And then it kind of fell by the wayside for a long time after he passed away. And then sure enough, transplanting faces and other things is back in vogue. So it's interesting.
Yeah, that you are literally
always behind the curve, though.
No, you could say behind the curve, or you could say you laid a lot of the foundational work that allowed it to happen.
I tried to excite people about transplant. The plastic surgeons were the original transplant surgeons.
Absolutely. And I would have to say Dr. Talmore gives you a lot of credit for her work for a couple of reasons. One is, so you had the microsurgical model, the composite tissue model, which is the precursor to face transplantation, is transplanting composite tissue. You insisted, she said, that she be the first author. You delighted in her success, and you never used it as many. I mean, it's the sort of typical that you work with a senior person, and that senior person sort of uses it to credit themselves, and you're part of their team, but you're not the one being highlighted. You are always highlighted. And, the fact that you are working with someone who, that you just had an academic interest in, I think is inspiring for plastic surgeons. I think that's something that we should look at and remember, that there's more than just what we do with our hands. It's thinking about the stuff that truly interests us, because you're right. It may not have a practical application right away that you can see, but look where it actually ended up. I love Dr. Steinman's story, the fact that he was working at Rockefeller Center or Rockefeller University. He received the Nobel Prize in 2011, but he is the only one who received it posthumously. Like you said, he passed in 2011, 3 days before he was awarded.
Yeah, right, Sam. And it was there's a significant amount of discussion as to whether or not he would qualify, because nobody else had passed away and was rewarded with the prize. But eventually, I believe the committee did decide that he did deserve it.
Yeah, and that to me is an amazing story. What was it like? What was he like as a person, when you, as a clinician and as a, working next to someone who has something so big? Is it different when you work with a Nobel Prize winning researcher as opposed to anyone else? Is there something different with that?
Well, I don't know. I don't have a vast experience. All I know is Ralph, and he was just very kind, very easygoing, laid back. He was just a pleasure to work with.
I want to ask you a little bit about your personal life and how it impacted your work. We just briefly met your son, who was helping us with the tech stuff. I know you also have a daughter, right? You have a son and a daughter. Your
correct.
son went to Harvard. He got a PhD at Harvard, and then he went to Stanford Law School. Is that all correct?
That's correct.
And then also your daughter is a general surgery resident at North Shore, and she is now currently applying for plastic surgery residencies.
That's right. So I'm very, very blessed with a beautiful family. Bob Grant, my successor and friend, often tells me that in 1987 I didn't have my boards in plastic surgery. Oh, actually, right, I had them in general surgery, but not in plastic surgery yet. And I was studying for the boards, and I had a little kid at the time, and he used to love to hold on to the steering wheel of the car, obviously when it was parked. And Bob reminds me that we were in the garage of Phipps' house, and he walked by, and I was studying for the boards with my index cards and review sheets with my son, who was playing with the wheel of the car. So that's where I studied, and that's his earliest memory. I would take the kids with me on rounds. I don't know if you can do that now, but they used to come with me to make rounds. One took to it like a fish in water. My daughter, my son was not so much. He takes after my wife. He's a very literary person. As you mentioned, he got his PhD in English, and then decided to go to law school. And now is taking a break from the law. He's doing his writing. He writes op-eds, and he works for a media mogul, and he's very happy. Not so happy living in the house now, but he's happy. My daughter, she's a general surgery resident and loves to operate. And she's decided to go into plastic surgery. She's going in late. She's applying after 5 years of general surgery. So we'll see what happens. God willing, she'll be joining us.
How much of that is what they did is them, and how much of it is a push, or or some parents shove from their parents? Like, where do you think that role is?
Yeah, that's a hard question, Sam. Very difficult. I mean, I would come home at night and at the dinner table talk about interesting problems that I saw. But I didn't push them. I didn't say you should do this. I didn't discourage them, but I didn't encourage them. Some of our colleagues, as you know, when their child says, well, I'd like to go into surgery or medicine or plastic surgery, they say, what, are you crazy? It's a horrible life. Don't do this. And I never did that. No, I didn't discourage them. Maybe subliminally I encouraged them, but I didn't discourage them.
Now, I did not know this until I started talking to people, but it was you did not grow up in Orthodox Judaism. You converted at some point as an adult, and in part it was for your family initially, but then people said you grew to embrace it as you grew in that community. Could you tell me a little bit about that?
Yeah, this may or may not be interesting to people. I feel like I grew up in a traditional Jewish home, but it wasn't particularly observant at all. And my son was in after school learning in a synagogue, and he was not happy there. He felt the kids were not very respectful, and the teacher befriended my wife, and she happened to be a member of the Orthodox synagogue. And she said, well, your son doesn't belong here. He belongs in a more observant environment. And she said, you should come hear our rabbi. And she went, and she said, you have to come hear him. And it started that way where they began. My son started in a religious school, and he was very, very happy there. My daughter um, eventually went there as well. It was very difficult for them to move from a public school where they were very happy to a religious school, which was a different curriculum. And so that was a journey for them, and they did well. And I think they're happy in their lives. From there, they went to Yeshiva High School, and then they studied in Israel for a year. And now they have their own lives and do what they think is important. It's been very good for me. I've been active in the community here. I've been very, very, very involved, and it's been a good thing. It's been a very good thing for me.
How big does faith inform your life or play a role in terms of what you
No,
do?
just trying to do the right thing, and that's what I tell the residents and junior faculty members. You know what's right in your heart, and you just try to be an ethical and moral person. I don't think you have to be religious particularly to do that, but it helps. It gives you a structure.
Now, you left Cornell and stepped down as chair, as you said. That was in 2000 and what was that? That's 4. And you left to go into solo private practice on the Upper East Side by yourself, doing primarily aesthetic plastic surgery.
Sam, there was an incident at the hospital, which we probably don't need to get into, but just to give you a general idea. In life, in academic life, you live for the possibility that somebody's going to walk into your office and say, Sam, I want to do something for you. That happened to me. A man walked into my office and said, Dr. Hoffman, you changed my daughter's life. I'd like to do something for you. So I put together a proposal. It turned into a lot of money. And I said, I think we better talk to the administration about this. And the administration was not particularly happy about it. He was a member of the board of trustees and said, they said, don't talk to him anymore. So I was very, very disheartened. I thought this would take us to the next level. He did provide funding, which allowed me, thank God, to bring you on faculty. So, in a sense, it worked out, but it could have been great. I could have given you and other people a lot more resources to work with, and that didn't happen. And I said, you know what? I've done this for 17 years. I've done what I can do. I think it's time for somebody else to take over. So I left, and I went into private practice. I'm not a businessman. And I think in retrospect, in order to succeed in private practice, it's okay to be a nice guy. It helps. It helps to be a good surgeon, have good results, helps to take care of your people. But I think ultimately, if you're not some kind of, entrepreneur or self-promoter, you're not going to flourish in private practice, at least in plastic surgery. That's my view of it. Not everybody agrees with me, but that's my view of it. So,
It's funny because I did not hear the whole story. I heard what was filtered through administration at the time, and that is obviously a very, that's one group's perspective. So I never really got to the opportunity to thank you for that. I didn't really, I'm not going to sit here and go through everything, but I didn't make the most of the opportunities. Certainly maturity, it always helps to look back and see what, coulda, woulda, shoulda. But, regardless, the environment that you had built and grown there, I don't think people are going to forget that regardless of what ultimately happened or I think people appreciate that.
I think, well, I hope so, but I really tried to instill in residents and junior faculty members kind of a philosophy philosophy of taking care of patients. I think that's the bottom line. I mean, that's what
Mhm.
we do.
All right.
Research is great. The teaching is great, and those are all important components of what we do.
Mhm.
Um, but I particularly think that the care of the patient has to be number one.
Mhm.
And I would urge people to really think about beginning a dialogue with the patient when they walk into your office. You really have to sit down and listen to them, listen to their story, because everybody has a story. You can't just look at their problem. You have to look at the person as a whole. Where'd you grow up? What do you do? Tell me about your family. All these things are important in establishing a dialogue with a patient. Then obviously you got to examine the patient and present all the options. I mean, everybody knows that. You take your boards, you learn exactly what to do and how to do it. And that's fine. I think though you need to continue that dialogue after the operation. And you need to say, okay, for example, you need to have the patient watch you put on the dressing. I think that's very important psychologically to them. You need to call the patient post-op and see how the patient is doing. Don't leave it to a nurse, okay? Or don't just not call them. You need to call them. They need to know that you're engaged. You operated on them. They trusted you. You need to call them to see how they're doing. When they come back into the clinic or wherever you are, you need to take out the sutures. Don't let anybody else take the sutures out. You need to. I know there are big shot plastic surgeons in New York who use chromic sutures so that dissolve so they don't have to see the patient again. Or they have the patient see their, fancy nurse. I don't think that's the way to go. I think you need to remove remove the sutures because again, you're establishing a dialogue. You're continuing to talk to the patient. I think when you dictate a note to the referring physician, whether that's at the time of the consultation or a progress note after, dictate it in front of the patient. Let the patient hear what you're saying about them to the referring physician, either after the consult or and and I think that helps. That helps tremendously in terms of developing a loyal patient follow and a nice practice. So I think those, if I had to, instruct people on what I did or how I did it, I think that's the most important. I mean, they can learn how to operate much better from other people, but it's the care of the patient, I think, that I try to instill in them.
It's so refreshing. It's funny how something so basic and fundamental is so refreshing to me because everything I have seen in terms of advice for what's for plastic surgeons out there is how do you grow your practice? How do you manage your quote assets? How do you manage your social media, your online reviews? How do you manage this, that, or the other thing? And it's so how to be more efficient with your time. How do you grow your ancillary services? So for someone to remind me, too, actually, as well as everyone else, uh, what are the basics about a patient relationship and care is something that I think gets lost. And I have to say, I don't do everything that you say you recommend, but I am going to I am going to do that. I am. I mean, there are some basics you have to get back to that you have to absolutely do. That's very important. Um, why did you come back to academic medicine then after all that time? You're one of the few people that I know who managed to do that anyway in the first
And
place.
it's true. It's unusual, but I have a very good relationship with Bob Grant, as I said, as I mentioned him before, my successor and friend. And he approached me and said, we can use you on the full time faculty. I thought he was going to say Cornell, but he said Columbia. At the time, I think I was feeling a little bit lonely. I enjoy having people around to talk to. It's great to have patients and staff, but um, I missed the collegial atmosphere, and it was feeling lonely. And the older you get, I think the more important it is to have people around, to bounce things off of, to talk to. I think that's important.
What cases do you still love doing? Like, what are the cases you still really enjoy the most at this point in your life?
You know, my initial love was hand surgery, and I think hand surgery is a beautiful thing. The anatomy is amazing. You get to sit down. A lot of it is patient dependent, so that can be difficult at times. Um, I think facelifts, because they're all different, they're all a challenge. I like that. I like that a lot. Um, yeah, I would say facelifting
Hmm.
at this point in my career.
What do you think you've had? I mean, you're still going strong, don't get me wrong, but you also have a lot of history that, and accomplishments that you've had. And as some people would say, you're on the back nine as opposed to starting the front nine. So what do you
Oh,
think of,
retirement.
I'm on the back nine too. And then what do you think about your legacy, or what do you want to be remembered as, or what do you think was most important or has been most important in terms of what you've done in your life, or plastic surgery, or anything?
Wow. Wow. I think I always say that my family is my claim to fame. Um, my community is very, very important, and being able to lead that community for a number of years was very important. I think being chief of a division was a blessing for me. Um, I just yeah, yeah, I think that's it. I mean, that's a lot. It's a lot.
I know I don't want to keep you too long, but I do have to ask you about a couple things very quickly. Um, I think one of the things people said universally is that you're reserved and you're not loud, but you are very funny when people get to know you. You have a real sense of humor about things. And so they told me a bunch of funny stories about, what they remember. And I can't really say them because they involve patients and, certain things that maybe they don't play well in 2020 as they might have back in 1980s or 90s. For example, you know, uh, okay, all right, well, like, okay, so, one with like a massive bariatric weight loss patient had a paniculectomy, and someone rounded and found, you know, food substances all over the patient, or maybe residents that were enamored by certain patients but did not know the whole story about those particular patients. And one of them, which I do have to ask you about, was basically, I won't name names, but it was a supermodel that had been seen emergently for leg cellulitis. The resident was very reluctant to see this young woman, went and saw her. It was a supermodel who had some tiny little spot on her leg, which was literally nothing. And he went back and told you about it. And he never knew if you actually went and saw this patient yourself. Do you remember who that was, and and if you did?
Sam, I'm sorry, I have no recollection.
Okay, I'm gonna have to do that off air and ask you about that one. Um, is there anything that I should have asked you about that I didn't ask you about?
No, in thinking about this interview, I thought you were going to ask about the future of plastic surgery and where I saw it and where I would say it was going. I'm very active in the New York Regional Society of Plastic Surgery, and it's a wonderful organization. And we talk about problems that we face in plastic surgery, both in academic and private practice. And this coronavirus situation has kind of put things into perspective, and people are really hurting. I mean, really hurting. Um, and I decided and this was before Corona, I decided that I was going to make a move because an opportunity presented itself at the Laser and Skin Surgery Center with a dermatologist, Roy Geronimus, that I respect tremendously, to join their group. And it's a very dynamic group of dermatologists. Do a lot of lasers and Mohs surgeries and other things, and things that interest me. Um, and I was thinking about that and thinking about what people are going through now. And I've just had a little bit of a taste of it. I go in just a few days a week and just for a few hours. And it's nice having people around, people who do different things. And one of our residents 10, 15 years ago joined a multi-specialty group in Westchester. And we all said, what are you doing that for? You know, be a plastic surgeon on your own or join a university? Because he's a very talented kid. He said, no, I like this. I think this fits me. He was the smartest one out of all of us. He developed a thriving practice, built-in referrals. I think this may be the wave of the future, is to have multi-specialty groups. I think it's very exciting to interact with other specialties, have a more global view of the patient, in whatever form that takes. So something that people in plastic surgery should think about. I think just going out now, especially now, and hanging out a shingle and starting on your own, I don't know how you do it. I just don't know how. So anyway, I think that joining groups, either groups of plastic surgeons who have different interests, or groups of different medical people, I think that may be the way of the future.
Like you said, there are some good people out there and bad people. You got to find the good people that you can trust to work with. And I think
Exactly, for sure.
Yeah. Dr. Hoffman, thank you so much for sharing your time.
You're the best. Thank you so much. I really appreciate the opportunity to chat with you and to think about some of these things.
I really appreciate it. Thank you for having your son troubleshoot the technical stuff for us. And I look forward to seeing you in real life again soon.
Take care.
Okay.